Good morning. Good morning, everyone. You're all very, very welcome. And good to see you all, because it's that time of year when everybody's going away, because we're in the last few weeks of summer. And people are trying to grab that last week in the sun by visiting the Lisburn Road. That's a promotional for the Lisburn Road. But it is, Monica, it's like the Mediterranean on the Lisburn Road. It really is. All we need is the sea. Anyway, I was, I don't know if many of you do this. Myself and Isabella went blackberry picking yesterday. Yeah? You do, Sheena? Absolutely amazing, along the Lagan. And it's coming down with blackberries. And my favourite pie is blackberry pie. I don't like blackberry tart, because tarts are narrow. I like it to be like that. So we have a pot like that. And I think, what did you say, 1 kilo of blackberries has gone into the pie? But it really, you got to get yourself down there before I get them. Blackberry ice cream. Is it blackberry ice? Oh, okay. I'll look up the recipe. I'll talk to you afterwards, Sheena. Anyway, get yourself down there, get loads of blackberries, and deprive the birds, I suppose. But they don't eat them all. And to ease our conscience, I said to Isabella, well, they don't eat the ones on the towpath because they see us. I think there's loads of beautiful blackberry bushes at the back of that. And that's where all the birds are eating the blackberries. So enough about blackberries, but it is... Anyway, I just love down by the Lagan. I could talk all day. What the fuck am I about the Lagan? It really is. It really is an incredible asset to Belfast. Okay, let us prepare ourselves for our hour of worship, meditation, and prayer. We are people of faith in each other, faith in the ability of all souls to make a difference, faith that our common humanity can sing in harmony, faith in a loving and compassionate God, faith in the divine working through us, who can only work through us to make the world a better place. Loving God, source of perfect love, who cares for all men and all women, such as we are, whose heart for us is unconditional love, whose mind of love throws searching light into the darkest of places. You who love what we are, yet who call still to what we can be. We live in a world of pain, hurt and hunger. Come to us with your peace and love. We are filled with the best of intentions. Help us to follow through with action. Amen. Somebody forgot to water that microphone. Now may we sing together our first hymn. And it's hymn number 282. Lift up your hearts, we lift them, Lord, to thee.
Good morning, everybody. The first reading today is taken from a book by Bill Darlinson, who was once minister of the Dublin Unitarian Church. And it's a book of short stories taken from different religions and different faith backgrounds around the world. And the story today is entitled Two Brothers, and it would be well known in Jewish and in Christian traditions. King Solomon wanted to build a temple in which his people could worship God, but he didn't know where to place it. It must be built on a piece of land that is very special, he thought. But where could that be? Late one night, he was taking his customary walk through the fields, and he noticed a man carrying a big sack of grain from one barn to another. The man did this 3 or 4 times. That man must be a thief, Solomon thought. But a little while later, another man appeared. This one was carrying sacks of grain too, but he was taking them back to the original barn. There's something strange going on here, thought Solomon. I need to work it out. The next day, he ordered the man to appear before him. Why do you steal grain from your neighbour? In the middle of the night, he asked. Your Majesty, I'm not stealing, the first man said. My neighbour is my brother. He is married and has many children. So he needs far more grain than I do, but he won't take any from me. So at night, when he's asleep, I secretly take a few sacks over to his barn. Then Solomon sent for another man and asked him why he carried the grain from one barn to another in the middle of the night. I have a wife and children, so I have plenty of help on my farm, but my unmarried brother has much to pay for and has to pay for help. He refuses to take any grain from me, so every now and again I secretly put a few sacks in his barn. Solomon called the 2 men together and told them what they had discovered. No wonder my store of grain never seems to diminish, they both said. The two brothers laughed as they embraced each other. Now I know where the temple shall be built, said Solomon. The place where the brothers love each other so much is the holiest place in my kingdom.
Thank you, Alan. And I know that Bill would be absolutely delighted that you read from his book this morning. And of course, he was the much-loved minister in Dublin for 15 years, I think. Now he's back living in Pontefract. Let us pray. Compassionate God, Spirit of life, help us to know you in our beginnings and in our endings. Help us to know you in our possibilities and our promises to others. Help us to be able to give thanks for all that we have at this moment and all that is yet to come. Compassionate and loving God, divine Spirit, Spirit that exists in all of us, we give thanks for this community, for this church. We are blessed with those who come amongst us, those who have traveled far to be here, those who have traveled through difficult circumstances to share their stories and their lives with us. We give thanks. We give thanks to all those who have sustained this community, who have preserved this building, who have looked after the fabric of the building throughout many years, who have sustained a community of faith, a place of meeting, a place of prayer, a place of song, of music, of love, a place of intellectual thought, of free thinking, of a religion without doctrine. We give thanks. Loving and compassionate God, we give thanks for the generations that have yet to come and the young children amongst us who will equally leave their mark on our blessed community and on our world. We give thanks. Amen. And now may we sing together our second hymn. And it is hymn number 365. Is that right? Prayer is the soul's sincere desire. Now for the second reading, I've selected a few verses from a poem by Philip Larkin. And I know later on Frances is singing The Lark in the Clear Air. And I said to her, don't let me get you fixated on the idea of Philip Larkin in the clear air. So don't forget you ever heard that, Frances. Now, Philip Larkin has been declared by many, many poets and scholars in England as probably one of the UK's greatest poets. Some would actually go so far to say he probably was, post-war, the best poet or the greatest poet in England. And what's interesting was he was here in Belfast from 1950 to 1955. He was a sub-librarian in Queen's University, and they barely celebrate him. I don't know why that is, but they were even asked on his 25th anniversary here, why did Queen's not celebrate Philip Larkin? They have a plaque up to him. I think that's as much as they've done. And he's celebrated in Hull in particular because that's where he spent most of his life. And there's a statue to Philip Larkin in Hull. He's been criticized lately. Allegedly, people claim that he was racist or that he was misogynistic because he did say that he could never get married. He could never marry a woman because it would be like being asked to stand on one leg for the rest of your life. Now, having said that, it's not. But that was Philip Larkin's view, and maybe a woman might say to marry Philip Larkin, being asked to stand on your hands for the rest of your life. But he had that type of humor. He had an issue with children, or allegedly had, but his letters say things differently about him. He didn't particularly like children around him, and he one time said to a young relative of his, "Please don't send me photos of your new children. It would be like sending pictures of garlic to vampires." That's Philip Larkin's humor. So he had a bizarre sense of humor, but he had a sense of humor. But his poetry was outstanding, in my opinion. He lived on Elmwood Avenue in an attic rooms on Elmwood Avenue. So it's really interesting to think of one of England's greatest ever poets pitched up in an attic on Elmwood Avenue writing poetry now that is regarded as some of the world's greatest poetry in the English language. He wrote, I'm only going to read a few lines from his poem at 31 When Some Are Rich, because it mentions about, well, you'll hear. At 31 when some are rich and others dead, I being neither have a job instead, but come each evening back to a high room above deep gardenfuls of air on which already have been laid an autumn bloom. So that's a little homage to Elmwood Avenue. It is now. The other thing is, he wrote quite a long poem about marching past. Now, Belfast being Belfast, how could he not? So the marching past was, he witnessed, I think it was an apprentice boys parade through Belfast, and he wrote a very long poem about that. I won't read that, I'll keep that for another day, maybe the 12th of July or something like that. What I do want to read to you is a few verses from church going, and he wrote this whilst living in Belfast. I like to think he came here because he lived in an attic across the road, but in the poem he talks about removing his bicycle clips, so he hardly cycled to All Souls. But hey, I've no doubt he must have dropped in here, because he wasn't a church-going person, but for some reason he liked going to churches. So I'll read you a few verses from church-going. And I think maybe at some later stage on his anniversary of his death, the 2nd of December, we might have a little poetry night dedicated to Philip Larkin. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut, another church. Matting, seats and stone, and little books sprawling of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now. Some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence. Brood God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new. Cleaned or restored, someone would know, I don't. Mounting the lectern, I pursue a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for, yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for. Wondering, too, when churches fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into, if we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plates and pyre in locked cases, and let the rest rent-free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? The profound words of Philip Larkin. And now, Muriel.
Good morning. The tune I'm going to play is called She Begs, She More, and this is another tune with a connection to All Souls because it was collected by Edward Bunting, the organist of this congregation from 1806 to 1817. This piece is said to have been the first piece composed by the blind harper Turlough O'Carolan. When in 1691, aged 21, he set out to make a living, one of the first houses where he stayed was that of Squire Reynolds in County Leitrim. Mr. Reynolds had been a harper and poet himself and was not that impressed by O'Carolan's harp playing. He was going away for a few days and he suggested that while he was away, O'Carolan could try his hand at songwriting instead. And that the theme could be a local Leitrim legend about two nearby hills, Shebeg and Shemore, the little fairy hill and the big fairy hill. So legend has it that the valley between the hills was the site of the last battle of Finn MacCool. One of Finn's heroes, or maybe Finn himself, was buried on Shebeg, and a hero of the other side was buried on Shemore. And the story goes that the battle continued to be carried on between Shebeg and Shemore by the immortal warriors. O'Carolan composed the song Shebeg, Shemore, and then went on to compose hundreds more melodies and songs. And here are a few verses from the song, translated from the Irish. Shebeg, Shemore, the fairy hills. Long, long ago in this ancient land, a battle took place where two hills now stand. And on the plain there lay the slain, for neither the battle was won. 'Twas after the battle the prophet foretold, no rest would be found for these warriors bold, till they unite and fight one common foe, and then would the battle be won. So the harper wrote of these fairy hills, where bloom the white flowers and daffodils, one big, one small, Shebeg, Shemore, and never the battle is won. O'Carolan based part of the tune on an older Irish air called the Bonnie Cuckoo, and you might hear the cuckoo in the tune. This is Shebeg, Shemore.
Thank you, Muriel. That was beautiful. Thank you. Many of you will know of our friends across the car park in the Forward in Faith International religious group, who most of them hail from, well, the overwhelming majority hail from Zimbabwe. And sadly, a couple of weeks ago, they lost one of their members who sadly died, and the funeral took place yesterday. Now, they did say to me they would hold the funeral in the hall, which they use as their place of worship. I said, no, you'll hold the funeral in the church. So they had a funeral service here yesterday for one of their friends, a much loved member of their congregation, David Jinga. And our thoughts and prayers go with David's family and his community, his much loved community at this stage. Now, it was interesting for myself and Isabella to be down here opening up the church and getting it ready for them yesterday morning, because the church was filled with people of color, Zimbabweans, which was probably the first time ever that things were reversed here, that the only two white people in the church were myself and Isabella. And it felt a little bit strange, and yet there was something incredibly wonderful and beautiful about it, particularly the singing from one of the young women who sang what I could only call an African lament over the coffin, which was beautiful. And we got to know some of them and chatted to some of them who worship in the hall, and also spoke to some of them who had travelled from England and up from Cork and other places to be with their community, the Zimbabwean black community throughout the British Isles, for a funeral of their friend. I juxtaposition this with our Pride service, because these are not the cultural norms of this church for most years. I imagine that's the first time ever on Saturday that the church had more or less a complete black African community for a religious service. And our Pride service every year has equally changed what was the norm and tradition in this building. And of course, our Iranian friends who joined us in All Souls, who are more than welcome and much loved in this church. I'm always conscious at Sunday service here that we speak in a particular way, we pronounce things in a particular way, we mention things in a particular way, and I'm conscious that people who have arrived here, it's very unfamiliar. And if there was some way we could make things a bit more familiar. But it's wonderful to have them amongst us. And in the hall, on 3 nights a week and on Saturday morning, there is karate. Now, karate wasn't always the staple diet of people in this church. But it's wonderful to see all the little kids and adults going in there 3 nights a week and on Saturday morning from right across the divide in Northern Ireland to their karate classes, and to hear them working out and to see the skills that these young people have. And then on a Wednesday night, of course, choir, the LGBT choir, rehearse every Wednesday. I think at the moment they're actually auditioning for new members. And why am I telling you this? I'm telling you because it has shown that in many ways we've remained the same. We're in a traditional building with traditional hymns and traditional pews and a traditional collar, and yet in many other ways we have changed, and we've become more diverse, more inclusive. And hey, that's what we claim to be, and that's what we should be. I know that in promoting the Belfast Mila, it states, and I think that's on today, you are guaranteed to experience the wonders of Belfast diversity with a spectacular week-long program of world music, dance, food, and art across the city. And as I said, I understand we have the Belfast Mila in the Botanic Gardens today. And this is Belfast City's annual celebration of global cultures, with thousands of visitors expected to visit Botanic Gardens. And again, like the things that have happened in All Souls Church, this is a new innovation here in Northern Ireland and adds to the sense of the city we live in. We still have as well the traditional St. Patrick's Day parade in Belfast, and of course the 12th of July parade, which goes along the Lisburn Road. So again, you have in the one area such incredible diversity and change, and yet also married in some way to the traditional. It's a thing I believe in. Not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but marrying the new with the old. Growing up in our respective Christian backgrounds, although not all of us did, we learned a little about when a stranger travels with you and when a stranger travels to your land. You shall do him, her, no wrong. And the stranger who travels with you shall be as the native amongst you. And you shall love him or her as you love yourself. For you were once strangers in Egypt. Now, that's a big ask for many people, and it can be difficult. And hey, sometimes we can't even travel with our own neighbors, and yet Scripture is asking us to travel with people from other lands. And I want to say a little bit about that today, in the whole idea of accepting change. I have a friend called Professor Graham Spencer. He's one of my closest friends, and he's a professor in Portsmouth University, and he lectures in history and communications. I really got to get Graham here to preach some Sunday. He's the funniest person you've ever met, along with myself. And he was one time a stand-up comic in Portsmouth. And he's the most unlikely professor you've ever met. And Graham he has a great gift for putting things in everyday language. When he talks about his mum, and he says things like, my mum doesn't like foreigners. And she often says, all those foreigners coming over here, taking all our jobs, running the NHS, you can't get into the shop with them. And he says, Mum, are you serious? Yeah, you shouldn't be allowed in, all these foreigners. And then Graham says to her, well, what about the Iqbal family that live next door to you? Lovely family, the Iqbals. Couldn't meet nicer people. And Mrs. Iqbal has shown me how to make naan bread. And then he says, what about the Dubonsky family that live the other side of your house? And she says, oh, they're those lovely people from Poland. They're really, really nice. And Graham says that when you unpick sometimes what you perceive to be prejudice, it's not prejudice at all. It's a fear. And I was reading a very interesting piece yesterday in the Irish Times, written by Niamh Jimenez, a young woman of colour who is now second generation Irish. And she was writing about the situation with particular reference to the Republic, where Ukrainian refugees are favored above all others. And there's some resentment of that, because Ukrainian refugees can work in the Republic. They're automatically on the health service, and they're being offered accommodation ahead of all other asylum seekers and refugees who have to continue living in what's called direct provision in the Republic, which is not very nice. And yet, there are arguments for that, and there are arguments against it. Even this young woman, Neve Jimenez, says, could this be because there are certain characteristics, things that define Irishness or that we believed define Irishness, like being white, being Catholic, or being Christian, mostly Catholic in the South, even in a cultural way. And is that what they see in other Europeans? But she's rightly concerned about various Irish government humanitarian policies and their racial bias that has happened throughout the years. Now, you wouldn't be aware of this, but going back to post the Second World War, Ireland did not accept Jews. The Republic of Ireland did not, it was the Free State then, did not accept Jews after the Second World War. And in recent reports released, and she reported this in the Irish Times, in one particular report from the Irish government, it said, Jews do not become assimilated with the native population. Immigration of Jews is generally discouraged. Now, Ireland has come a long way since then, and yet, in some ways, it has remained the same. The suspicion of the foreigner, and also trying to adjust to new people coming amongst us. Lenny Henry, now Sir Lenny Henry always said, when he visited Dublin to do a stand-up comic routine, he could see that he was probably the only black person in Dublin. And he said sometimes when he met mates of his who were black and had visited Dublin, they would say to him, do you know what, Lenny? I was in Dublin last week and someone said to me, hello, Lenny. Why would they do that? Because Lenny Henry is the only black person they know. So they say hello, Lenny, to every black person they see, thinking it's me. Now again, Ireland has changed dramatically since that. And I would say to Neve Jimenez, and her article was, in my opinion, correct, in my opinion, challenging, but I would say she probably fails to understand how the new situation works amongst people. A little bit like what I said about Graham's mum, and how Irish people perceive themselves. It's a very short space of time since Ireland, particularly the Republic, was 95% Catholic and white. And now it has something like 15% of the population are from overseas and quite diverse. And people in urban areas are trying to work around that and to accept it. So I would be very careful to chastise people when they're equally on a journey. I think it's unfortunate when some people use the term racist at everything they hear and everything they perceive, because all you're doing is locking people out instead of trying to bring them on a journey with you. For some, it is the sense of their community won't ever be the same. Their shops will change. Their pubs will change. How many times when you visit Dublin do you hear people saying, Dublin pubs are not the same. There's no Dublin barman there anymore. And I remember, this is true, I remember I was in an Irish pub, it's a famous Irish pub, on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington with some Belgians. And the Irish barman was the rudest person I ever met, which was kind of traditional for Irish barmen. And these Belgians said, oh, isn't that wonderful? He's such a traditional Irish barman. You know that thing, come on now, folks, drink up, drink up. Have you no home to go to? They were always worried about you being homeless. Have you no home to go to? And that was the Irish barman. And yet people loved the Irish barman, and people regret the decline or demise of the Irish barman. But it doesn't make them racist. It doesn't make you racist because you want someone to be rude to you. And then the other thing is how they approach the stranger. Some cultures are very alien to people. When you approach someone who is wearing a veil or indeed a face covering, it seems to be cutting you out. I always, when I see an Islamic woman wearing a veil, if I'm in a shop making a purchase, I always say, Salam alaikum. And I get the biggest smile back, and alaikum salam. But having said that, myself and Isabella, had the privilege of visiting Pakistan, being the guest of Islamic people, and traveling with them throughout Pakistan and learning a bit about their ways. Mind you, not all Islamic women wear veils and burqas either. And I know that throughout my life, I have traveled far and wide, and I have experienced the most incredible kindness from people. The most incredible kindness. Going right back to the time when I was a young lad and I couldn't afford to go around Europe, so I hitched everywhere. And it was unbelievable the kindness that I would meet, where somebody would say, have you eaten? And bring you to their home for a meal before you traveled on their journey. In the Netherlands, in Belgium, when the Belgian police picked me up and drove me to the German border. I don't know what the intention of that was. They said, we just wanted to give you a lift. But they said, there's Germany, why don't you go in there? But loads of very, very incredible kindness. In India, in Pakistan, in America, in El Salvador, when I went to a little village outside San Miguel with an Irish priest from Limerick, Padre Alfredo, Father Alfie, but there he was known as Padre Alfredo. And we went to the humblest of houses in this village, where they put chicken on Alfie's plate and my plate. And I got a fork, and Alfie got a knife. And I said to Alfie, I don't seem to get a knife. And he said, shh, don't ask, that's all the cutlery they've got. And this chicken is probably the first chicken they've killed in over a year. And they've done it for us. That is the sort of generosity I've experienced. So when we think of those things, how could you not be welcoming and kind to the person that has come amongst you? Knowing that when they've arrived here, how foreign this is. You know, we know Alf Garnett used to go on about bloody foreigners. And when someone would say, but Alf, over there, we're foreigners. No, we're not. The British are not foreigners. No, they're foreigners, we're the British. And we forget that when we're in other places, we are the foreigner. So when people come amongst us, we have to do our utmost to make them feel welcome, make them feel comfortable, and at the same time, have your concerns, but know that the fears you have are probably the fear of fear itself, and not really fear of the other. In the New Testament, the most often cited passage dealing with welcome the stranger is from Matthew 25, 31 to 40. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Now, I know some people will ask, well, how many strangers should we welcome? But that is a bigger question. That's a bigger question than we can resolve here. We are a church. We're not the Home Secretary. Every country, in my opinion, every country has a right to determine how strict or unstrict its borders will be. But we expect that to operate within the clear definitions of international law on refugees and asylum seekers. There'll be much debate about that from every quarter and what that means. But what I'm saying is that when somebody does arrive, no matter how they arrive, that we listen to Matthew 25. That's the only obligation for us. Not to determine how they got here. That's a bigger question for other people. But when the stranger comes amongst us, irrespective of their circumstances, we travel with that stranger as if he, she is the native amongst us. And we will love that stranger as ourselves, because we were all strangers in the land of Egypt. Amen. I know a man who's no stranger, Sam.
How you doing, folks? Good afternoon. So we're just announcing that the lovely Your Space group is back after our summer break. So we're back on the second Thursday of September, which is Thursday the 8th at 7 p.m. here in the church. And we'll be watching the fabulous Sister Act. So you're all welcome to come along, and we'll have a great night. Thanks so much. Thank you.
And just a couple of other notices. I know Sam and Maureen and Alan travelled up to Stroke City, Londonderry for Foyle Pride. So well done. I saw you all on social media. Congratulations. You're kind of doing the rounds of all the prides. Mid-Ulster, Belfast, non-stop tour of All Souls. Well done. That's great. And please, everybody, you're more than welcome to stay and have tea and coffee and wee buns. So please stay and join us afterwards. And if you've any spare cash just to pay for the tea and the buns, it's more than welcome. Any few bob that you have that you don't need. I know you're probably all saving it up for the utility bills, but if you if you have any spare, please. Right. And our final hymn. Oh, sorry, yeah, Francis.
I just, golly, entirely unintentional. I just wanted to say a few words by way of introduction. So Samuel Ferguson was a local boy. He was born in Belfast on High Street in 1810. And that puts him in the same historic patch as the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. He went to the academy. He went on to Trinity College, Dublin. He read law and graduated barrister. He was always fond of Irish history, particularly ancient Irish history. And he was an antiquarian, an archaeologist, a writer, a public servant, a writer of beautiful poetry. He married Mary Guinness. She was the great niece of Arthur Guinness of the brewery. And she was a great influence on him, urging him to write his poetry. And she herself had heard someone singing, she'd heard it several times, this particular air, which she thought was lovely. It was an old Irish song. And she persuaded her husband Samuel to write words, to write the lyrics, we would say, to this lovely song. And he did so. Now, he died in Howth, just outside Dublin, in 1886. So he was only, I say, 76 years old. And he's buried in Dunor, which is quite near Templepatrick. There's a lovely little church. I think it's called St. John. Is that right, Chris? St. John. It's on the hill at Donegal. And I was walking there one summer afternoon years ago because I was interested in the 1798 rebellion. I once lived in a house that had connections with that. And I was looking around because Henry Joy McCracken, etc., were based there at one time. And I was in the churchyard of the little church, and I saw swallows swooping in, swooping out, swooping in, swooping out. And I thought, my goodness, the speed they go at, and they don't seem to have brakes, they just go in straight out. And I went up closer, and I saw that the floor of the porch was covered with opened newspapers, what you do when you wash the floor. And this was to catch the droppings coming from the swallows who'd made their nests in the roof of the porch. And here's the punchline. I looked down at the newspapers, and I wondered why they were so flat, not ruffled up by the wind or people's feet, and they were surrounded by little stones to keep them down. But there was a big, heavy advertisement in the middle of one of the papers, and it said, private flying lessons. And I thought, of all creatures that on earth do dwell, the swallow certainly doesn't need flying lessons. But I'm assuming that it was because it was so near the airport. And I just thought that was lovely. And as I turned to walk away to leave, I saw this headstone, and it was Sir Samuel Ferguson's grave. And I thought of the lark in the clear air and wondered what poetry he might write for the swallows flying over his headstone. And whenever I go down the motorway there, I glance up at the little church, and in my mind, I'm humming this song, which is The Lark in the Clear Air.
Dear thoughts are in my mind.
Thank you, Francis. And now may we sing together our final hymn, Go Work in My Vineyard, My Garden and Field. May the words we have spoken and the dreams we have shared and the faith we have renewed this morning give us wisdom, comfort, and courage for all the days ahead. For the way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Amen. God bless you all. Go in peace.